Nothing breaks a woman's heart quite like watching the man she loves walk away on what should have been the happiest day of her life. Every mother, daughter, and sister knows that pain of betrayal that cuts deeper than any knife. Sarah Mitchell felt that agony as she stood abandoned at the altar, her wedding dress now torn and dusty on the frontier ground. She had run as far as her legs could carry her into the Wyoming wilderness, her future as empty as the endless prairie. When wealthy rancher Jack Morrison found her weeping at the edge of town, he made her a simple offer. "I need a woman and you need a home." It was meant to be just a practical arrangement between two broken souls. But would two wounded hearts discover that sometimes the deepest love grows from the darkest moments? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The torn silk of Sarah's wedding dress caught on a sagebrush as she stumbled further from the town of Cedar Ridge, each ragged breath burning her lungs in the thin mountain air. Behind her, the church bells had long since stopped their mocking chime, but the echo of gasps and whispers from the congregation still rang in her ears. Thomas Hartwell had looked her straight in the eye at the altar, his face pale as fresh snow, and simply said, "I can't do this, Sarah. I'm sorry." Then he had walked away, leaving her standing there in front of God and everyone, her dreams crumbling like autumn leaves. The humiliation had been unbearable, her mother's face stricken with shock and shame, her father's jaw clenched so tight she thought it might crack. The pitying looks from neighbors who had watched her grow from a hopeful girl into a woman who believed in happily ever after. Sarah had gathered the yards of ivory silk in her trembling hands and run from that church as if the devil himself were chasing her. Now, 3 miles from town, she collapsed beside a weathered fence post, her chest heaving with exhaustion and grief. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the Wyoming territory, painting the endless grassland in shades of gold and amber. It should have been beautiful, but to Sarah, it looked as desolate as her future felt. Jack Morrison had been riding fence line when he spotted the white figure huddled against his property marker. At first, he thought it might be a lost calf wrapped in canvas, but as his black stallion drew closer, he realized it was a woman in what appeared to be a wedding dress. His weathered hands tightened on the reins as he dismounted, his boots crunching on the dry grass. "Ma'am?" His voice was low and careful, the way one might speak to a wounded animal. "Are you hurt?" Sarah looked up through tear-swollen eyes to see a tall man silhouetted against the setting sun. He was older than her 22 years, maybe 35 or 40, with dark hair graying at the temples and kind eyes the color of summer sky. His clothes marked him as a rancher leather chaps over worn denim, a vest over a cotton shirt, and a hat that had seen countless seasons of wind and weather. "I'm fine," she whispered, though they both knew it was a lie. Jack studied her for a moment, taking in the expensive dress, now stained with dirt and tears, the delicate hands bleeding from thorns, the proud tilt of her chin despite her obvious distress. He had seen that look before in his own reflection, years ago when life had dealt him a hand he hadn't known how to play. "Name's Jack Morrison," he said, tipping his hat. "This is my land you're resting on, and I don't mind the company, but night's coming on fast, and these mountains get cold after dark." Sarah tried to stand, her legs shaking from exhaustion and shock. "I should go back to town." "Should you?" Jack asked quietly. "Seems to me like you came this far for a reason." The simple question broke something loose inside her, and fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. "I can't go back. Not like this. Not after." Her voice cracked. Jack reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a clean bandana, offering it to her without a word. As she dabbed at her eyes, he made a decision that would change both their lives forever. "I've got a proposition for you, miss," he said, his voice steady and matter-of-fact. "I need a woman, and you need a home. I'm not talking about love or romance or any of those pretty words that seem to cause more trouble than they're worth. I'm talking about a practical arrangement between two people who understand that life doesn't always give us what we want, but sometimes it gives us what we need." Sarah stared at him, certain she had misheard. "Are you asking me to marry you?" "I'm asking you to consider it," Jack said. "I've got a ranch 10 times bigger than this town, more cattle than I can count, and a house that echoes with emptiness. I work from sunrise to sunset, and I need someone to help make it feel like more than just a place to sleep. In return, you'd have a roof over your head, food on your table, and a name that carries respect in this territory." The wind picked up, sending Sarah's torn veil dancing across the prairie grass. She watched it disappear into the gathering dusk and felt something inside her shift. The girl who had walked into that church this morning full of romantic dreams and trust in happily ever after was gone. In her place sat a woman who understood that sometimes survival mattered more than sentiment. "You don't know anything about me," she said. "I know you're brave enough to run toward the unknown rather than stay somewhere you're not wanted," Jack replied. "I know you're strong enough to make it 3 miles in a wedding dress across rough country, and I know you're proud enough to keep your chin up even when your world's falling apart. That tells me everything I need to know." Jack pulled his father's gold pocket watch from his vest, the weight of it familiar in his palm. The timepiece had belonged to 3 generations of Morrison men, each of whom had built something lasting on this harsh but generous land. His father had carried it while building the ranch from nothing. His grandfather had clutched it during the Indian Wars. Now it was Jack's turn to carry on the family legacy, but he couldn't do it alone. "I won't lie to you about what this would be," he continued, snapping the watch closed. "It would be a marriage of convenience, nothing more. I'd give you your own room, your own space, and I'd never ask for more than you're willing to give. But I'd expect you to help run the household, maybe learn to keep the books, be there when the ranch wives come calling. In return, you'd have security and a fresh start where nobody knows your story unless you choose to tell it." Sarah looked back toward town, where the lights were beginning to twinkle in windows, where families gathered for supper, where her name would be whispered with pity and scandal for months to come. Then she looked at this stranger who offered her something she had never expected, honest terms with no false promises. "Why?" she asked. "Why would you want to tie yourself to someone else's broken dreams?" Jack was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the distant mountains. "Because broken things can still be useful, and sometimes they're stronger after they've been mended." He looked at her directly then, and she saw something in his eyes that matched her own hurt. "I'm not asking you to love me, Miss Mitchell. Sarah Mitchell. Miss Mitchell, I'm not asking for your heart. Lord knows I wouldn't know what to do with it if you gave it to me. I'm asking for a partnership, a chance for both of us to build something worthwhile out of what's left of our separate disasters." As if to punctuate his words, a coyote howled somewhere in the darkness, its lonely cry echoing across the empty prairie. Sarah pulled her torn skirts closer around her and made a choice that terrified and liberated her in equal measure. "All right, Mr. Morrison," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I accept your proposition." Jack nodded once, as if sealing a business deal rather than proposing marriage. "Then let's get you somewhere warm, and tomorrow we'll ride into town and make it legal." He helped her onto his horse, and as they rode toward the distant lights of the Morrison ranch, Sarah felt the weight of her old life falling away behind her like discarded clothes. She didn't know what lay ahead, but for the first time since Thomas had walked away from their altar, she felt something other than despair. She felt possibility. The marriage contract lay between them, on the kitchen table like a bridge neither was quite ready to cross. Judge Harrison had drawn up the papers with efficient strokes of his pen, outlining the terms Jack had dictated in his calm, businesslike manner. Property rights, household expectations, financial arrangements, all reduced to neat paragraphs of legal language that somehow made the whole arrangement feel both more real and more surreal. "It's not too late to change your mind," Jack said quietly, though something in his voice suggested he hoped she wouldn't. Sarah stared at the document, her name already signed in her careful schoolgirl script below a dozen clauses that would govern her new life. The ink was still wet, like tears on paper. "Is it what you want, Mr. Morrison, truly?" He was quiet for so long that she looked up from the contract to find him studying her face as if trying to memorize it. "I want a lot of things I can't have, Miss Mitchell. This arrangement gives us both something we need, and that's more honest than most marriages start with." The ceremony itself was brief and witnessed only by Judge Harrison and his wife, a kindly woman who had offered Sarah a clean dress to replace her ruined wedding gown. The simple blue cotton felt strange after the elaborate silk she had worn the day before, but it fit well enough and didn't carry the weight of shattered dreams. "Do you, Sarah Elizabeth Mitchell, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, as long as you both shall live?" The words felt heavy in the small courthouse room. Sarah looked at Jack's weathered profile and saw a man who carried his own invisible wounds with dignity. "I do. Do you, John Morrison, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, as long as you both shall live?" "I do." His voice was steady, but Sarah noticed the slight tremor in his hands as he slipped a simple gold band onto her finger. It was too large, obviously borrowed from someone else for the ceremony, but it felt surprisingly warm against her skin. "Then by the power vested in me by the territory of Wyoming, I now pronounce you husband and wife." Judge Harrison closed his book with a soft thud that seemed to echo in the silence. "You may kiss the bride." Jack looked at Sarah with something like apology in his eyes before leaning down to brush his lips gently against her cheek. It was the most chaste wedding kiss in the history of matrimony, but it sent an unexpected warmth through her that had nothing to do with romance and everything to do with human kindness. The ride to the Morrison Ranch took 2 hours through country that grew more beautiful and intimidating with each mile. Rolling hills gave way to vast grasslands that stretched to the base of mountains so tall their peaks disappeared into clouds. Sarah had never seen land so big or empty, and by the time they reached the ranch house, she felt smaller than she ever had in her life. The house itself was grander than anything in Cedar Regia, 2-story structure built from local stone and timber, with a wraparound porch and windows that caught the afternoon light like jewels. Outbuildings dotted the landscape, barns, bunkhouses, corrals, and workshops that spoke of a working ranch run with efficiency and care. "It's beautiful," Sarah said, and meant it. "It's home," Jack replied, dismounting and helping her down from the wagon. "Or it will be, if you let it." The interior was as impressive as the exterior: high ceilings, well-made furniture, and evidence of a woman's touch that had been maintained even in absence. Sarah ran her fingers along a hand-carved mantelpiece and wondered about the woman who had chosen the fabrics and arranged the furniture with such care. "My mother's work mostly," Jack said, following her gaze. "She had strong opinions about how a house should feel." "It feels loved," Sarah said softly. Jack showed her through the main floor parlor, dining room, kitchen, and study before leading her upstairs to a hallway lined with closed doors. He stopped at the second door on the right and opened it to reveal a bedroom that took her breath away. The room was spacious and bright, with 2 large windows overlooking the back pasture where horses grazed in the evening light. A 4-poster bed dominated the space, its quilt obviously handmade and well cared for. A writing desk sat beneath one window, and a comfortable chair was positioned to catch the morning sun. "This is your room," Jack said, setting her small bag of belongings on the chest at the foot of the bed. "There's a key if you want privacy, and I'll respect whatever boundaries you set." Sarah turned to find him already backing toward the door, his hat in his hands and uncertainty in his posture. "Where will you sleep?" "Master bedroom's at the end of the hall, far enough away that you won't be disturbed." He paused in the doorway. "Supper's usually at 6, but don't worry about cooking tonight. Maria left us something we can heat up." "Maria?" "Wife of my foreman, Carlos. She helps with the house when needed, does the heavy cleaning and such." "You'll meet her tomorrow." Jack hesitated, then added, "She's been eager to have another woman around the place. Gets tired of cooking for a bunch of cowboys who think salt is a seasoning and anything green is suspicious." The first smile Sarah had managed in 2 days tugged at the corners of her mouth. I know my way around a kitchen, Mr. Morrison. Jack, he corrected gently. We're married now, Sarah. Might as well use first names. After he left, Sarah sat heavily on the edge of the bed and tried to process the enormity of what she had done. 24 hours ago, she had been Sarah Mitchell, spinster daughter of the town's blacksmith, about to become Mrs. Thomas Hartwell and settle into a predictable life of church socials and garden parties. Now she was Mrs. John Morrison, wife to a man she barely knew, mistress of a ranch larger than some counties back east. The marriage contract rustled in her pocket as she stood to unpack her few belongings. She pulled it out and read through the terms again, each clause a reminder of the clinical nature of their arrangement. Property rights clearly defined, household duties outlined, financial responsibilities detailed. And at the bottom, in Jack's precise handwriting, a final clause that hadn't been there when Judge Harrison first drew up the papers. Should either party wish to dissolve this marriage, they may do so with 60 days' notice and no penalty to either side, provided both parties agree to the dissolution. It was an escape clause, she realized. Jack's way of ensuring she never felt trapped by their bargain. The thoughtfulness of it brought unexpected tears to her eyes. A knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. Sarah, supper's ready if you are. She found Jack in the kitchen, ladling stew into bowls with the careful movements of a man who had been cooking for himself too long. The domestic scene felt both natural and strange, this tall, weathered rancher performing such ordinary tasks in his own home. Smells wonderful, she said, taking a seat at the wooden table that could have seated 8, but tonight held only 2. They ate in comfortable silence, the day's events settling between them like dust after a windstorm. Outside, the sounds of the ranch filtered through the windows, cattle lowing in the distance, horses nickering in the corral, the soft murmur of cowboys finishing their evening chores. What do you expect of me? Sarah asked finally, setting down her spoon and meeting his eyes across the table. Jack considered the question with the same seriousness he might give to planning a cattle drive. Honestly, I'm not entirely sure. It's been a long time since this house had a woman's presence. I suppose I'm hoping you'll help it feel like a home again instead of just a place where I sleep and eat. And if I can't, if I'm not what you need, then we'll figure it out as we go, he said simply. Marriage, even one like ours, isn't something you master overnight. My parents were married 37 years, and my mother used to say they were still learning how to be married the day my father died. Sarah traced the rim of her water glass with one finger, absorbing the weight of his words. Were they happy? Most days. Jack's smile was gentle and sad. They had their share of trouble's drought years, cattle disease, times when the money ran so thin you could see through it. But they weathered it together, and that seemed to matter more than whether they were happy every minute of every day. After supper, Jack showed her how to bank the kitchen fire and check the locks on the door-7ing rituals she would need to learn as mistress of the house. Then he walked her to the bottom of the stairs and paused, his hand on the newel post. If you need anything during the night, just call out. I'm a light sleeper. Thank you, Sarah said, and realized she meant it for more than just his offer of help. For everything. For finding me yesterday, for offering me this chance, for treating me with more kindness than I had any right to expect. Jack looked down at his boots, clearly uncomfortable with gratitude. We both got something we needed out of this arrangement, Sarah. No need for thanks. But as she climbed the stairs to her new room, Sarah suspected that wasn't entirely true. Jack Morrison had saved her from more than just a cold night on the prairie, and she found herself wondering what exactly he hoped to save himself from in return. The bedroom felt different now that she knew it was truly hers. She changed into her nightgown and brushed out her hair by lamplight, trying to imagine herself living this life for years to come. It should have felt overwhelming, but instead, she felt something she hadn't experienced since Thomas had walked out of their wedding, a sense of purpose. Tomorrow, she would begin learning how to be a rancher's wife. Tonight, she would sleep in a real bed, under a solid roof, protected by a man who had asked for nothing more than her presence and partnership. It wasn't the fairy tale she had once dreamed of, but it was something real and honest and surprisingly comforting. Outside her window, the Wyoming night stretched endless and full of stars, and for the first time in her adult life, Sarah Mitchell Morrison fell asleep without knowing exactly what tomorrow would bring and found that uncertainty less frightening than she had expected. Sarah woke to the sound of roosters crowing and the distant lowing of cattle, unfamiliar sounds that took her a moment to place. Sunlight streamed through the bedroom windows, painting golden rectangles on the polished wooden floor. She had slept better than she had in months, despite everything. Her mother's recipe book lay open on the bedside table where she had placed it the night before, its worn pages filled with familiar handwriting that made her heart ache with homesickness. The leather-bound volume had been a wedding gift from her grandmother, passed down through 3 generations of women who had found comfort and purpose in feeding their families well. Sarah traced her finger along a recipe for buttermilk biscuits, remembering the smell of her mother's kitchen on Sunday mornings. A knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. "Sarah, I'm heading out to check the north pasture. There's coffee on the stove and eggs in the basket by the door if you're hungry." "Thank you," she called back, listening to Jack's footsteps recede down the hallway. The house settled into quiet around her, and she realized this was her first morning as mistress of her own home, even if the circumstances were far from traditional. She dressed quickly in her simplest dress and made her way downstairs to explore the kitchen in daylight. It was a cook's dreamer, massive cast-iron stove, deep sinks with a hand pump for water, and shelves lined with dishes and cooking implements that spoke of meals prepared for large groups of hungry workers. But it felt cold and unused, as if it had been merely functional for too long. The coffee Jack had left was strong enough to wake the dead, and Sarah found herself smiling as she imagined the Cowboys who probably preferred their morning brew to resemble liquid courage more than a civilized beverage. She cracked 4 eggs into a skillet and began to cook, the familiar rhythm of breakfast preparation grounding her in this strange new reality. She was just sliding the eggs onto a plate when the kitchen door opened and a woman about her own age stepped inside, carrying a basket of fresh bread. The woman had dark hair braided down her back and warm brown eyes that crinkled at the corners when she smiled. "You must be the new Mrs. Morrison," the woman said in lightly accented English. "I'm Maria Hernandez. My husband Carlos is the foreman." "Sarah," she replied, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "I'm pleased to meet you." Maria set her basket on the counter and studied Sarah with frank curiosity. "You are younger than I expected." "I'm 22. Maria began unpacking her basket, revealing not just bread but also fresh butter, jam, and what appeared to be sweet rolls. "Jack, he is a good man, but he has been alone too long. Sometimes I worry he forgets how to talk to people who are not cows or horses." Despite everything, Sarah found herself laughing. "He's been very kind to me." "Kind, yes, but kind is not everything in a marriage." Maria fixed her with a knowing look. "Though I suppose you will figure that out for yourself." They worked together to prepare a more substantial breakfast, Maria chattering about the ranch and its people while Sarah listened and learned. There were 15 cowboys in Jack's employ, plus Carlos and Maria and their 2 children. During roundup and branding season, the numbers doubled. The ranch covered nearly 50,000 acres and ran close to 3,000 head of cattle. "It is a big responsibility," Maria said, watching Sarah's eyes widen at the numbers. "But Jack, he has good instincts about cattle and better instincts about people. If he chose you, there must be a reason." "He needed a wife and I needed a home," Sarah said quietly. "It's not more complicated than that." Maria's laugh was rich and musical. "Oh, mija, it is always more complicated than that. Men think they know what they need, but they usually discover they need something entirely different." Jack returned as they were finishing breakfast, his boots loud on the kitchen floor and his hat dusty from riding. He stopped short when he saw Maria, then looked between the 2 women with something like relief in his expression. "Maria's been showing me around the kitchen," Sarah said, "and bringing enough food to feed an army." "She does that," Jack agreed, helping himself to coffee and one of Maria's sweet rolls. Carlos says she's trying to single-handedly prevent starvation in Wyoming territory. Someone has to make sure you eat something besides beef jerky and coffee, Maria retorted, but her tone was affectionate. Now that you have a wife, perhaps she can take over the job of keeping you properly fed. Jack glanced at Sarah, and she saw uncertainty flicker across his features. Only if she wants to. This arrangement doesn't include obligations she didn't agree to. The careful politeness of his words stung more than Sarah expected. She understood that he was trying to be considerate, but his formality made her feel like a guest in what was supposed to be her own home. "I'd like to learn," she said firmly, "about the kitchen, the ranch, all of it. I may not have married for love, Mr. Jack, but I didn't marry to be useless either." Something shifted in Jack's expression, though she couldn't quite read what it meant. "All right then, Maria, would you mind showing Sarah whatever she needs to know about running the household?" "Of course." Maria beamed as if this had been her plan all along. "We start today with the pantry and the root cellar, then tomorrow we meet the other wives." After Jack left for his day's work, Maria proved to be an excellent teacher and an even better source of information about the Morrison Ranch and its master. She showed Sarah through every room of the house, explaining the routine of cleaning and maintenance, pointing out which furniture had been Jack's mother's and which he had added himself. "He built this house for his first wife," Maria said casually while they inventoried the linen closet. Sarah's hands stilled on a set of embroidered pillowcases. His first wife, Elizabeth. They were married only 2 years before she died in childbirth. Maria's voice gentled. The baby died too. Jack, he grieved hard and long. When he finally stopped grieving, he stopped feeling much of anything at all. How long ago? 8 years now. He has not looked at another woman since. Maria studied Sarah's face carefully. Until you. Sarah felt heat creep up her neck. "This isn't that kind of marriage, Maria. We both understand what this arrangement is." "Do you?" Maria asked. "Because from where I stand, it looks like two lonely people who are afraid to admit they might want something more than just convenience." They worked their way through the rest of the house, Sarah taking mental notes about everything from which floorboards creaked to how to operate the complicated system of pulleys that opened and closed the heavy curtains in the parlor. By afternoon, her head was spinning with information, but she felt more grounded than she had since arriving. The kitchen became her sanctuary. She spent the late afternoon preparing supper from her mother's recipe book, choosing dishes that would be substantial enough for a hard-working rancher, but refined enough to show that the Morrison house now had a woman's touch. Pot roast with vegetables, fresh bread, and apple pie made from fruit Maria had brought from her own trees. When Jack returned at sunset, he stopped in the kitchen doorway and simply stared. The room glowed with warmth from the stove and lamps, filled with aromas that spoke of comfort and care. Sarah stood at the counter, sleeves rolled up and flour in her hair, looking more at home than any woman had in his house for 8 years. "Something smells incredible," he said quietly. "I hope you're hungry." Sarah wiped her hands on her apron and gestured toward the table, which she had set with his mother's good china and a small bouquet of wildflowers she had picked near the back porch. They ate in companionable silence, Jack making appreciative sounds that warmed Sarah more than any elaborate compliment might have. When he reached for a second helping of everything, she felt a little bloom of pride that surprised her with its intensity. "This is how the house used to feel," Jack said suddenly, his fork halfway to his mouth. "When my mother was alive, when Elizabeth—" He stopped, looking stricken. "It's all right," Sarah said gently. "Maria told me about your first wife. I'm sorry for your loss." Jack set down his fork and stared at his plate. "I don't want you to think you need to replace her or fill some role that isn't yours to fill. This arrangement is about practical needs, not about the past." "I know." Sarah chose her words carefully. "But that doesn't mean we can't make new memories or find our own way of being comfortable together. A house should feel like a home, regardless of the reasons people share it." When Jack looked up, his eyes held something she hadn't seen before, a flicker of hope quickly shuttered behind his usual caution. "You have good instincts about making a place feel welcoming. My mother always said that feeding people well was one of the simplest ways to show you cared about them. Your mother sounds like a wise woman." Sarah's smile was tinged with sadness. "She is. I hope someday I'll be able to introduce you to her when enough time has passed that my sudden marriage doesn't seem quite so scandalous." That night, as Sarah reviewed the day while brushing her hair before bed, she found herself thinking less about the life she had left behind and more about the one she was building. It wasn't the fairy tale she had once imagined, but there was something satisfying about the work, something comforting about the routine, and something unexpectedly pleasant about Jack's quiet presence across the dinner table. Her mother's recipe book lay open beside her, and she made a mental note to try the chicken and dumplings recipe tomorrow. A man who appreciated good cooking deserved to be fed well, and Sarah was beginning to discover that taking care of Jack Morrison's comfort gave her a sense of purpose she had never found in the idle pursuits expected of unmarried women in town. It was, she thought, as she settled into sleep, a beginning. The rhythm of ranch life began to settle around Sarah like a comfortable quilt. She woke each morning to the sound of Jack moving quietly through the house, preparing for another day of work that took him from dawn to dusk across the vast expanse of his land. By the time she made it downstairs, he would be gone, leaving only the lingering scent of coffee and leather behind. She found herself looking forward to these quiet morning hours when the house belonged entirely to her. The kitchen had become her domain, and she took pleasure in planning meals that would sustain Jack through his long days and welcome him home in the evenings. Her mother's recipe book had proved invaluable, its pages guiding her through dishes she had only watched being prepared in her childhood home. On her fourth morning, as Mrs. Morrison, Sarah discovered Jack in the kitchen before dawn, sitting at the table with a cup of coffee and a small piece of wood in his hands. He was carving something with careful, precise movements, his large fingers surprisingly delicate as they guided the knife. "I'm sorry," she said, suddenly self-conscious in her dressing gown. "I didn't know you were still here." "Early meeting with Carlos about the breeding program," Jack explained, not looking up from his work. "Didn't want to wake you with the extra noise." Sarah poured herself coffee and sat across from him, curious about what he was creating. In the lamplight, she could see that the piece of wood was taking the shape of a small bird, its wings spread as if caught mid-flight. "That's beautiful," she said softly. Jack's hands stilled, and for a moment she thought he might put the carving away, but instead he turned it slightly so she could see it better. "My father taught me," said a man's hands needed something to do in the quiet hours besides worry. "Your father was wise." "He was." Jack's knife resumed its careful work. "Died when I was 25, left me this ranch and more responsibility than I thought I could handle. My mother said he knew I was ready, but I felt like a boy playing at being a man for years afterward." Sarah studied his face in the golden lamplight, noting the lines around his eyes that spoke of years spent squinting into sun and wind, the quiet strength in his posture, even in this moment of relaxation. "What changed? When did you stop feeling like you were playing?" Jack considered the question while he shaped the bird's tail feathers. "The first year I turned a profit on my own decisions, I suppose. When I realized the ranch was thriving because of choices I had made, not just because I was following my father's blueprint." "How long did that take?" 5 years. His smile was self-deprecating. "I'm apparently a slow learner." "Or thorough," Sarah suggested. "There's a difference." Their eyes met across the table, and Sarah felt something shift between them, a small crack in the careful politeness they had maintained since their wedding. It was the first truly personal conversation they had shared, and she found herself hungry for more. "What about you?" Jack asked. "What did you want to be when you stopped being your parents' daughter?" The question caught Sarah off guard. No one had ever asked her what she wanted beyond marriage and motherhood, the expected destinations for women of her generation. "I used to dream about traveling," she admitted, "seeing mountains and oceans and cities bigger than anything I could imagine. I wanted to know what the rest of the world looked like." "What stopped you?" Reality, I suppose. Women don't travel alone, and I had no money for such adventures even if they did. She traced the rim of her coffee cup with one finger. Besides, Cedar Ridge was my whole world. I couldn't imagine any other life until Thomas left me at the altar and forced me to imagine one. Sarah had been at the ranch for 2 weeks when she found the photograph hidden in Jack's desk drawer. She hadn't intended to snoop, she was simply looking for a pen to record the morning's egg count in the household ledger when her fingers brushed against the edge of what felt like a picture frame tucked beneath some old bills. The daguerreotype showed a young woman with delicate features and dark hair arranged in the elaborate style of a decade past. She wore a wedding dress of obvious quality, her smile radiant with the joy of a bride who believed in happily ever after. On the back, in Jack's careful handwriting, were the words, Elizabeth Morrison, beloved wife, 1872, 1874. Sarah stared at the photograph for a long moment, studying the face of the woman who had been Jack's first choice, his heart's desire, the love he had built this house to shelter. Elizabeth had been beautiful in the ethereal way that men wrote poetry about, all soft curves and gentle eyes that promised comfort and understanding. Standing in Jack's study with the photograph in her hands, Sarah felt the weight of comparison settle on her shoulders like a heavy shawl. She was not beautiful in Elizabeth's delicate way. Her features were too strong, her hands too practical from years of helping her father in his blacksmith shop. Where Elizabeth looked like she had been born to grace a parlor and pour tea for visiting ladies, Sarah looked like exactly what she was, a frontier woman who could work hard and weather storms. Sarah? Jack's voice from the kitchen made her heart leap with guilt. She quickly replaced the photograph and closed the drawer, but not before the image had burned itself into her memory. "Coming!" she called, smoothing her skirts and trying to compose her expression. Jack was standing at the kitchen table with Carlos, both men studying what appeared to be a hand-drawn map. Their faces were serious, and Sarah noticed that Carlos kept glancing toward the windows as if expecting trouble. "Is everything all right?" she asked. Jack looked up, and for a moment his expression was unguarded enough that she could see worry lines around his eyes. "We've had some cattle go missing from the north pasture. Could be wolves, could be rustlers." Carlos found tracks that suggest it might be the latter. "How many head?" Sarah asked, surprising both men with the practical nature of her question. "Dozen so far," Carlos answered. "But if it's rustlers, they'll be back for more. They always are." Jack folded the map and tucked it into his vest pocket. "We're going to ride out and see what we can find. I want you to stay close to the house today, Sarah. If there are rustlers in the area, it's better to be cautious. How long will you be gone?" "Hard to say. Could be back by supper, could be late." Jack hesitated, then added, "Maria's staying here today with the children. You won't be alone." After the men left, armed and riding with the grim purpose of men who understood that their livelihood was under threat, Sarah found herself unable to concentrate on her usual tasks. The house felt different somehow, less secure, and she caught herself listening for sounds that didn't belong. Maria arrived mid-morning with Miguel and Isabella in tow, her usually cheerful demeanor subdued. "Carlos told me to bring the children here," she explained. "Safer to be together if there's trouble brewing." They spent the morning baking bread and tending to household tasks, but Sarah noticed that Maria kept checking the locks on the doors and windows. The children, sensing the tension in the adult world around them, played quietly and asked fewer questions than usual. It was while they were preparing lunch that Isabella tugged on Sarah's skirt and pointed toward the kitchen window. "Senora Sarah, there are men coming." Sarah's heart jumped as she looked out to see 3 riders approaching the house at a leisurely pace that somehow seemed more threatening than a gallop would have been. They were strangers, roughly dressed and sitting their horses with the casual arrogance of men who were used to taking what they wanted. "Maria," Sarah said quietly, "take the children upstairs to my room and lock the door. Don't come down no matter what you hear. Sarah, you should come too. Someone needs to deal with them, and it should be the mistress of the house." Sarah's voice was steadier than she felt. "Go now." Maria gathered her children and disappeared up the stairs, just as the riders stopped in front of the house. Sarah smoothed her apron, checked that her hair was properly pinned, and opened the front door before they could knock. Whatever else happened, she would meet trouble on her own terms. The leader of the group was a man in his 40s with graying hair and eyes like chips of winter ice. His smile was pleasant enough, but it didn't reach those cold eyes. "Afternoon, ma'am. Fine day, isn't it?" "It was," Sarah replied evenly. "What can I do for you, gentlemen?" "Name's Fletcher. These are my associates, Graves and Murphy." The man gestured to his companions without taking his gaze off Sarah. "We're looking for some stray cattle that might have wandered onto Morrison land. Thought we'd ask permission to look around." "I'm afraid my husband isn't here to give such permission," Sarah said. "You'll need to come back when he's home." Fletcher's smile widened. "Now that's a shame. We've come such a long way, and cattle don't wait for convenient timing, do they?" He dismounted and took a step toward the porch. "Maybe you could help us out, point us in the right direction at least." Sarah's hand found the door handle behind her, but she didn't retreat. "As I said, you'll need to speak with my husband. Mr. Morrison should return this evening." "Mr. Morrison," Fletcher repeated as if tasting the name. "That would be Jack Morrison, owner of all this fine land and cattle." "It would. Heard tell he just got himself a new wife. That would be you, I'm guessing." Sarah didn't like the way Fletcher looked at her, or the way his companions had spread out to flank the house. "Yes, that would be me. And I'm sure my husband will be interested to hear that strangers have been asking questions about our family." Fletcher chuckled, but the sound held no warmth. "No need to mention this little visit to Jack, ma'am. Wouldn't want to worry him unnecessarily. We'll just take a quick look around for our missing cattle and be on our way." "You will not." Sarah's voice carried the authority of 3 generations of strong women who had learned to stand their ground when necessary. "This is private property, and you have not been given permission to search it. I suggest you leave now, before my husband returns with his men." For a moment, Fletcher's pleasant mask slipped, revealing something far more dangerous underneath. But before he could respond, the sound of horses approaching at a hard gallop drew everyone's attention to the road. Jack and Carlos appeared over the rise, riding fast with dust streaming behind them. Even at a distance, Sarah could see the set of Jack's shoulders and knew that he had recognized the strangers for what they were. Fletcher remounted quickly, his casual demeanor returning as if it had never left. "Looks like your husband's back, ma'am. We'll just be going now. Nice talking with you." The 3 men spurred their horses and rode off toward the south, not hurrying but not lingering either. Jack and Carlos thundered into the yard. Seconds later, Jack dismounting before his horse had fully stopped. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his eyes scanning Sarah from head to toe as if checking for damage. "I'm fine. They claimed to be looking for stray cattle, but they were casing the place." Jack finished grimly. "Seeing how many people were here, what kind of defenses we have." He looked toward the house. "Where are Maria and the children?" "Upstairs. I sent them up when I saw the riders coming." Jack studied her face, and Sarah saw something shift in his expression. "You stayed down here alone to face 3 armed men." "Someone had to represent the house," Sarah said simply. "I wasn't about to let strangers intimidate me in my own home." Carlos had been listening to this exchange with growing amazement. "Senora, those men are dangerous. They could have—" "But they didn't," Sarah interrupted. "And now they know that the Morrison Ranch isn't an easy target, even when the men are away." Jack was still staring at her as if seeing someone he had never met before. "Elizabeth would have hidden with Maria and the children," he said quietly, and Sarah realized he hadn't meant to speak the words aloud. The comparison stung, especially with the image of beautiful, delicate Elizabeth fresh in her memory. "I'm not Elizabeth," Sarah said, lifting her chin. "I never pretended to be." "No," Jack said, his voice strange. "You're not." That evening, after Maria and the children had returned safely to their own home and extra guards had been posted around the ranch buildings, Jack found Sarah in the kitchen finishing the supper dishes. She had been unusually quiet during the meal, and he suspected his careless words about Elizabeth were the reason. "I owe you an apology," he said without preamble. Sarah didn't turn around from the sink. For what? For comparing you to Elizabeth. That was unfair to both of you. Was it? Sarah's voice was carefully neutral. From what I've heard, she was everything a man could want in a wife. Beautiful, gentle, refined, the kind of woman who deserved to be loved. Jack moved to stand beside her at the sink, noting the rigid set of her shoulders and the way she scrubbed at an already clean plate with unnecessary force. "Sarah, look at me." She turned reluctantly, her brown eyes guarded, and her jaw set in a way that reminded him forcibly of her courage that afternoon. "Elizabeth was a good woman," Jack said carefully. "She was kind and gentle and everything you said. But she was also fragile in ways that would never have survived what happened today. She would have been terrified by those men, helpless to defend herself or anyone else. And that makes her less valuable? It makes her different. Not better or worse, just different." Jack reached out and touched Sarah's cheek with surprising gentleness. "This afternoon, you faced down 3 dangerous men to protect Maria's children and defend our home. Elizabeth couldn't have done that, wouldn't have even tried. But you did it without hesitation, and you did it well." Sarah searched his face, looking for signs of the comparison she dreaded. "Do you wish I were more like her?" "Sometimes," Jack admitted, and Sarah's face fell. "But more often, I'm grateful you're exactly who you are." Elizabeth was suited to a different kind of life, a gentler one than what we have here. You're suited to this life, to this place, to me. The last words were spoken so quietly that Sarah almost missed them, but when their meaning registered, she felt something warm unfurl in her chest. "Jack," she whispered. But he had already stepped back, the moment of vulnerability closing like a door. "Get some rest," he said. "Tomorrow we'll start teaching you to shoot, just in case those men decide to come back when I'm not here." As Sarah climbed the stairs to her room, she thought about the photograph hidden in Jack's desk and realized that she no longer resented Elizabeth's memory quite as much. The dead woman would always hold a piece of Jack's heart, but that didn't mean there wasn't room for someone else to find a different kind of place there. The wooden bird sat on her windowsill where she had placed it weeks ago, and Sarah found herself hoping that someday she might earn a place in Jack's heart that was entirely her own, not because she was like Elizabeth, but because she was nothing like her at all. The morning lessons in marksmanship began 3 days after the incident with Fletcher and his men. Jack set up targets behind the barn, far enough from the house that the sound wouldn't carry to neighboring ranches, but close enough that Sarah could practice daily. The rifle he chose for her was smaller than his own Winchester, designed for someone with less upper body strength, but still capable of stopping a man at reasonable distance. "The first rule of shooting," Jack said, standing behind her as she held the unfamiliar weight of the weapon, "is never point this at anything you don't intend to destroy. The second rule is that if you do point it at something, you'd better be prepared to pull the trigger." Sarah nodded, trying to focus on his instructions rather than the warmth of his body so close behind her. His hands covered hers on the rifle, adjusting her grip and showing her how to sight along the barrel. "Breathe in, let half the air out, then squeeze the trigger gentle-like," he murmured near her ear. "Don't jerk it, just apply steady pressure until it surprises you." The rifle kicked against her shoulder when she fired, and she missed the target entirely, but Jack's patient smile told her he had expected as much. "Better than my first shot," he said. "I was so afraid of the noise that I closed my eyes and nearly shot Carlos's hat off his head." They practiced for an hour each morning, Jack's teaching style as steady and methodical as everything else he did. He never showed impatience when she missed, never made her feel foolish for flinching at the report. Gradually, Sarah's shots began to find the target, then the center rings, and finally the bullseye with satisfying regularity. "You're a natural," Jack observed on the morning she put 3 shots in a group smaller than a silver dollar. "Better than most of my cowhands." Sarah lowered the rifle and looked at him with surprise. "Really?" "Really, though I hope you never have cause to use that skill for anything more serious than target practice." But even as he spoke, they both knew that Fletcher and his men were still somewhere in the territory, and rustlers weren't known for giving up easily when they'd found a ranch worth robbing. The threat became real again 2 weeks later, when Carlos discovered the remains of a butchered steer in a canyon 5 miles from the main house. The animal had been killed and dressed with professional efficiency, the hide and choice cuts taken while the rest was left for scavengers. "They're living off our cattle while they scout the ranch," Jack said grimly as he and Sarah studied the evidence. "Getting bolder too. This kill is from yesterday, maybe the day before." Sarah had insisted on riding out with him to see the site, despite his protests that it wasn't safe or proper for a lady. She had pointed out that she was neither safe nor proper anyway, having married a stranger and learned to shoot in the space of a month, and that someone needed to understand the full scope of what they were facing. Now, looking at the scattered bones and dried blood, she felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain wind. "How many men do you think there are?" "Hard to say. Could be 3, could be a dozen. Men like Fletcher usually work in small groups, but they've got contacts all through this territory." Jack remounted his horse and offered Sarah a hand up to her own mount, a gentle mare named Daisy, who had been selected specifically for her calm temperament. "What's our next move?" Jack looked surprised at her use of "our," but pleased as well. "We increase the guard rotations, pull the cattle closer to the main buildings, and send word to the neighboring ranches. Rustlers are everyone's problem out here." The ride back to the ranch gave Sarah her first real look at the country Jack had promised to show her. Rolling hills covered in autumn grass stretched to distant mountains that wore caps of early snow. Hidden valleys folded between ridges like secrets waiting to be discovered. It was beautiful and vast and empty in a way that both thrilled and intimidated her. "It's like being at the edge of the world," she said as they paused on a ridge that offered a view of the entire Morrison spread. "Sometimes it feels that way," Jack agreed, "especially in winter when the snow cuts us off from town for weeks at a time. You have to be comfortable with your own company out here, and with the company you keep." Sarah glanced at him, noting the way the afternoon light caught the silver in his hair and the strong line of his profile against the mountain backdrop. "Are you comfortable with the company you keep?" Jack's smile was slow and genuine. "More comfortable than I expected to be, yes." They rode home in companionable silence, Sarah's mind full of the beauty she had seen and the quiet satisfaction of being included in Jack's planning rather than protected from it. As they approached the ranch buildings, she noticed a buggy in the yard that she didn't recognize. "Visitors," Jack observed, his tone carefully neutral. The visitor turned out to be Mrs. Abernathy, the pastor's wife from Cedar Ridge, accompanied by Sarah's own mother. Both women were dressed in their best traveling clothes and wore expressions of barely concealed horror at finding Sarah in riding attire, dismounting from a horse like a common cowhand. "Sarah Elizabeth Mitchell," her mother said, using the full name that had always meant trouble in Sarah's childhood. "What on earth are you doing?" "It's Morrison now, Mother," Sarah replied, accepting Jack's help down from the saddle and noting how his presence at her side seemed to give her courage. "And I was learning about my husband's ranch. Jack thought I should understand what we're protecting." Mrs. Abernathy's eyebrows rose toward her hairline. "Protecting? Good heavens, child, what kind of household is this?" Jack stepped forward with the polished courtesy that Sarah was learning masked his deeper feelings. "Mrs. Mitchell, Mrs. Abernathy, welcome to the Morrison Ranch. I'm Jack Morrison, Sarah's husband." Sarah's mother studied Jack with the sharp eyes of a woman assessing her daughter's future. Sarah held her breath, wondering what her mother would see in this quiet, weathered man who had offered shelter to her scandalous daughter. "Mr. Morrison," her mother said finally, "I've come to see how my daughter is settling into married life." "She's settling beautifully," Jack replied. "Sarah has proven to be everything I could have hoped for in a wife and partner." The word partner seemed to surprise both visiting women, but Sarah felt warmth spread through her chest at hearing it. They spent the afternoon in the parlor, Sarah serving tea and cakes, while her mother and Mrs. Abernathy interrogated her about her new life with the relentless efficiency of a military campaign. Had Mr. Morrison been treating her well? Was she attending church? Was she eating properly? Had she been receiving callers? "We don't have many neighbors close enough for calling," Sarah explained. but Maria Hernandez visits regularly, and the other ranch wives are planning to come for supper next week. Mexican neighbors, Mrs. Abernathy whispered, as if discussing something scandalous. Carlos Hernandez is my foreman, Jack said quietly. One of the best men I've ever worked with. His wife, Maria, has been invaluable in helping Sarah learn to manage the household. Sarah's mother, who had spent years working alongside immigrants in the diverse community around the blacksmith shop, merely nodded, but Mrs. Abernathy's expression suggested she found such arrangements highly irregular. The conversation continued through supper, during which Sarah's mother made careful note of the quality of the food, the cleanliness of the house, and the respectful way Jack treated her daughter. By the time the visitors prepared to leave the next morning, Sarah could see approval in her mother's eyes, even if she was too proud to voice it directly. "You look well, daughter," her mother said as she embraced Sarah in the yard. "Happier than I've seen you in years." "I am happy, Mother. Different than I expected, but happy. Mr. Morrison seems like a good man, a serious man, but good." Her mother glanced toward Jack, who was helping Carlos load the women's luggage. "He looks at you like you matter to him." "We have a good partnership," Sarah said carefully. "Partnerships can grow into more, given time and patience." Her mother squeezed Sarah's hands. "Don't be so afraid of caring for him that you miss the chance for real happiness." After the buggy disappeared down the road toward town, Sarah found herself alone with Jack for the first time in days. The house felt oddly quiet after the constant chatter of visitors. "Your mother is a formidable woman," Jack observed. "She liked you," Sarah said. "I could tell." "How?" "She didn't lecture you about taking proper care of me, which she would have done if she had any doubts about your character." Sarah began clearing away the tea things, grateful for something to do with her hands. "And she called you a good man when she said goodbye." Jack was quiet for a moment, then said, "She called you Sarah Elizabeth Mitchell when she first arrived." "Old habit. She's always used my full name when she was displeased with me." "But you're not Sarah Elizabeth Mitchell anymore." Jack moved closer, his voice dropping to that low tone that did strange things to her composure. "You're Sarah Morrison now. My wife, my partner, the woman who faced down rustlers and learned to shoot and turned this house back into a home." Sarah looked up to find him watching her with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. "Jack, I know we agreed this was just a practical arrangement," he continued, "but somewhere along the way, it stopped feeling practical and started feeling real." Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs as she processed what he was saying. "What are you telling me?" "I'm telling you that you matter to me. More than I expected, more than I planned for." Jack reached into his pocket and pulled out something small and silver. "I'm telling you that I'd like this to be a real marriage, if you're willing." He opened his palm to reveal a delicate ring, clearly made for a woman's hand, with a small but perfect diamond that caught the lamplight like captured starlight. "Jack," Sarah whispered. "It was my grandmother's," he said quietly. "She gave it to my mother when she got engaged, and my mother gave it to me before she died. Said I'd know when I found the right woman to wear it." Sarah stared at the ring, then at Jack's face, seeing vulnerability there that he rarely allowed anyone to witness. "I still wear my ring from Thomas," she said, indicating the simple band that had never felt like it truly belonged to her. "I know, but maybe it's time to let go of what never was and reach for what could be." Sarah looked down at her left hand, at the ring that represented broken promises and shattered dreams. Then she looked at Jack, this good man who had offered her shelter and respect, and was now offering something infinitely more precious. Slowly, she pulled Thomas's ring from her finger and set it on the kitchen table. Her hand felt strange without it, naked and new. "Are you sure?" she asked Jack. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life." Sarah held out her hand, and Jack slipped his grandmother's ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, as if it had been waiting all this time for the right woman to claim it. "Mrs. Morrison," Jack said softly. "Mr. Morrison," Sarah replied, and when he leaned down to kiss her, it felt like the beginning of something real and lasting, and entirely their own. Sarah was in the garden behind the house, harvesting the last of the autumn vegetables before the first hard frost, when she heard hoofbeats approaching at a pace that suggested urgency rather than casual visiting. She straightened from the potato rows, brushing dirt from her hands and shading her eyes against the afternoon sun to see who was coming. The rider was alone, which immediately struck her as odd. Since the rustling incidents began, no one traveled the territory without company if they could help it. As the horse and rider drew closer, Sarah felt her blood turn to ice water in her veins. Thomas Hartwell sat astride a bay gelding, dressed in a fine wool coat and polished boots that marked him as prosperous rather than practical. His blonde hair was perfectly groomed, despite the long ride, and his handsome face wore the same charming smile that had once made her heart flutter with girlish dreams. "Hello, Sarah," he said, dismounting with the fluid grace that had always drawn feminine attention. "You're looking well. Marriage appears to agree with you." Sarah's hands clenched into fists at her sides, her wedding ring, Jack's grandmother's ring pressing into her palm like a talisman. "What are you doing here, Thomas?" "I came to see you, of course. To talk." Thomas tied his horse to the garden gate with casual familiarity, as if he had every right to make himself at home on Morrison property. "Surely you can spare a few minutes for an old friend." "An old friend?" Sarah's voice was sharp enough to cut glass. "Is that what you call a man who abandons his bride at the altar?" Thomas had the grace to look ashamed, though Sarah noticed the expression didn't quite reach his eyes. "I know I hurt you, Sarah. I know what I did was unforgivable. But I had my reasons, and I think you deserve to hear them." "I don't want to hear your reasons," Sarah said firmly. "I want you to leave now." "Please." Thomas stepped closer, and Sarah caught the scent of expensive cologne that seemed out of place in the clean mountain air. "Just hear me out. After that, if you still want me to go, I will." Against her better judgment, Sarah found herself curious about what possible explanation Thomas could offer for the humiliation he had put her through. "5 minutes," she said. "Then you leave." Thomas's smile was relieved and grateful. "Thank you." "Sarah, the truth is, I was offered an opportunity I couldn't refuse. Victoria Ashford, you remember the banker's daughter from Denver who came to visit the Hendersons last spring? Her father approached me with a business proposition. Marriage to Victoria would have meant a partnership in the bank, a house in Denver, a future I could never have built on a blacksmith's wages." Sarah stared at him, the casual cruelty of his words hitting her like physical blows. "So you left me standing at the altar for money?" "For our future," Thomas corrected, reaching out as if to touch her arm. Sarah stepped back sharply. "Sarah, I never stopped loving you. But love doesn't pay bills or put food on the table. I thought if I could establish myself financially, I could come back for you later, offer you something better than a struggling life in Cedar Ridge." "And what happened to your grand plan?" Sarah asked, though she suspected she already knew. Thomas's expression darkened. "Victoria proved to be less enamored with me than her father had suggested. She called off our engagement 2 weeks before the wedding, said she had met someone else. Her father withdrew his business offer, and I found myself with nothing, no bride, no partnership, no prospects." "So now you come crawling back to your second choice," Sarah said, her voice deadly quiet. "You were never my second choice," Thomas said urgently. "You were always the woman I loved. I just got confused about what was important." "What's important," said a low voice from behind Sarah, "is that you're trespassing on my land and disturbing my wife." Sarah turned to see Jack approaching from the direction of the barn, his Winchester rifle held casually but ready in his hands. His expression was calm, but Sarah had learned to read the subtle signs of his anxiety, slight tightening around his eyes, the deliberate control of his movements. Thomas straightened, his charm faltering in the face of Jack's obvious competence and barely controlled hostility. "Mr. Morrison, I presume." "I'm Thomas Hartwell, an old friend of Sarah's from Cedar Ridge." "I know who you are," Jack said, stopping beside Sarah and positioning himself slightly in front of her. "And I know what you did to her. The question is what you're doing here now." "I came to see Sarah, to apologize for past mistakes and—" "To what?" Jack's voice was deceptively mild. but Sarah felt the tension radiating from him like heat from a forge. Thomas glanced between Jack and Sarah, apparently realizing for the first time that his charm and good looks might not be sufficient to handle this particular situation. To offer her a chance to return to her real life, to the life she was meant to have. The silence that followed was so complete that Sarah could hear the wind moving through the grass and the distant lowing of cattle. Jack's knuckles whitened on his rifle, and Sarah realized that Thomas had just crossed a line that could get him shot. Her real life, Jack repeated, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. Jack, Sarah said quickly, placing a hand on his arm. She felt the tension in his muscles, coiled like a spring ready to snap. Let me handle this. She turned to face Thomas fully, and when she spoke, her voice carried all the authority she had learned from managing a frontier household and facing down armed rustlers. You want to know about my real life, Thomas? My real life is here, with a man who has treated me with more respect and kindness in 2 months than you showed me in 2 years of courtship. My real life is running a ranch that covers more territory than you've probably seen in your entire sheltered existence. My real life is being married to someone who considers me a partner, not a convenient accessory to his ambitions. Thomas's face flushed red. Sarah, you can't possibly prefer this rough frontier existence to the civilized life I could give you. You're an educated woman. You deserve better than cooking for cowboys and living in the wilderness. Civilized? Sarah's laugh was sharp and bitter. You mean like abandoning your bride at the altar because someone offered you a better deal? Like showing up uninvited at another man's home to try to steal his wife? That kind of civilized? I'm not trying to steal you, Thomas protested. I'm trying to save you from a mistake. Sarah, this man doesn't love you the way I do. This marriage is nothing but a business arrangement. You're right, Sarah said, and she felt Jack's quick glance of surprise. It started as a business arrangement. An honest one, with terms clearly stated and respected by both parties, but it's become something more, something real and solid and infinitely more valuable than the pretty lies you told me. She pulled a folded paper from her apron pocket, the threatening letter that had arrived that morning while Jack was out checking the cattle. She had been debating whether to tell him about it, but Thomas's appearance had made the decision for her. You want to know how civilized your love is, Thomas? This arrived today. She handed the letter to Jack, watching his face darken as he read the contents. The message was brief but clear. Sarah belonged to Thomas Hartwell, and if she didn't return to Cedar Ridge voluntarily, he would take steps to reclaim what was rightfully his. You threatened my wife, Jack said, his voice so low it was barely audible. I gave her fair warning, Thomas replied, puffing up with false bravado. Our engagement may have been interrupted, but it was never formally ended. I have a legal claim. You have nothing, Jack interrupted, stepping forward. Sarah is my wife, legally married and properly documented. Any claim you think you have died the moment you walked out of that church. Did it? Thomas smiled, but there was something ugly in his expression now. Because I've been talking to some interesting people about the Morrison Ranch. About cattle that have been going missing, and men who ask a lot of questions about your security arrangements. Amazing how helpful people can be when they're offered the right incentives. Sarah felt the blood drain from her face as the implications hit her. You're working with the rustlers. I'm working with men who understand the value of what I'm trying to reclaim, Thomas said. Sarah, last chance. Come with me now, and all this unpleasantness can be avoided. Your husband's cattle will be safe, his men won't be hurt, and you can return to the life you were meant to live. And if I refuse? Thomas shrugged with elaborate casualness. Accidents happen on frontier ranches. Rustlers can be unpredictable, even violent. It would be tragic if something happened to your husband or his men because you were too stubborn to see reason. Jack had heard enough. In one smooth motion, he raised his rifle and aimed it directly at Thomas's chest. Get off my land, now. Jack, no, Sarah said urgently. He's not worth it. You're right, Jack agreed, though he didn't lower the rifle. He's not worth the cost of a bullet, but if he's not gone in the next 30 seconds, I might forget that fact. Thomas mounted his horse with hands that shook slightly, his earlier confidence evaporating in the face of Jack's cold competence. "This isn't over, Sarah. I'll give you time to think about what I've said, but I won't wait forever." "Don't wait at all," Sarah replied. "My answer is no, today and every day for the rest of my life." They watched him ride away, and only when he disappeared over the ridge did Jack lower his rifle. Sarah realized she was shaking, whether from anger or fear or both, she couldn't tell. "He's working with Fletcher," Jack said grimly. "That's how they knew so much about our security, our routines. Someone's been feeding them information. And now they're using that information to threaten you because of me." Sarah's voice was thick with guilt. "Jack, I'm so sorry. I never imagined." "This isn't your fault," Jack said firmly, turning to face her. "Thomas Hartwell made his own choices, just like he did when he left you at that altar. You're not responsible for his greed or his cowardice. But if I hadn't married you, if you hadn't married me, I'd still be half dead inside, going through the motions of living without remembering what it felt like to be truly alive." Jack set his rifle aside and took her hands in his, mindful of the dirt and calluses that marked them both as working people. "Sarah, what you said to him about our marriage becoming something real, did you mean it?" Sarah looked into Jack's blue eyes and saw everything she had come to value in the past 2 months. Strength without cruelty, kindness without weakness, love that had grown quietly and steadily without fanfare or pretty speeches. "I meant every word," she said. "Thomas can threaten all he wants, but he can't take away what we've built together. I'm not the woman who stood at that altar waiting for him to make me happy. I'm the woman who chose to build a life with you, and I choose it again today." Jack's kiss was fierce and desperate, full of promise and possession and relief. When they broke apart, his forehead rested against hers, and Sarah could feel the tremor in his hands. "Whatever comes next," he said, "we face it together." "Together," Sarah agreed, and meant it with every fiber of her being. In the distance, storm clouds were gathering over the mountains, and Sarah knew that the real test of their marriage was just beginning. Thomas had made his intentions clear, and men like Fletcher didn't make idle threats. But as she stood in Jack's arms, with his grandmother's ring solid and warm on her finger, Sarah felt something she had never experienced before. The absolute certainty that she was exactly where she belonged, with exactly the right man, ready to fight for exactly the right reasons. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of approaching rain and the distant sound of cattle moving restlessly in their pastures. Somewhere out there, dangerous men were making plans that would threaten everything she and Jack had built together. But Sarah Morrison was no longer the frightened girl who had fled into the wilderness in a torn wedding dress. She was a rancher's wife, a woman who had learned to shoot and stand her ground and protect what mattered most. Let them come, she thought fiercely. They would discover that the Morrison ranch was defended by more than just cattle and cowboys. It was defended by 2 people who had found something worth fighting for and who had no intention of letting anyone take it away. The War Council convened in Jack's study that evening, the room filled with the low murmur of serious men discussing serious business. Carlos sat across from Jack's desk, his weathered hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. Tom Bradley from the neighboring ranch had ridden over as soon as he received Jack's message, bringing news that rustlers had hit his spread 2 nights before, making off with nearly 30 head of cattle. "It's coordinated," Tom said, his voice grim. "Too coordinated to be coincidence. Someone's been watching all our operations, learning our patterns, figuring out when we're most vulnerable." Sarah stood beside Jack's chair, her presence both surprising and somehow natural to the assembled men. Word had spread quickly through the ranching community about the new Mrs. Morrison, and her reputation for competence and courage had preceded her. When Jack had suggested she join their planning session, no one had objected. "Thomas Hartwell," Jack said, speaking the name like a curse. "My wife's former fiancé. He as much as admitted to working with Fletcher's gang when he came here this afternoon." Carlos spat into the spittoon beside his chair. "A man who would threaten a woman is no man at all." "He's desperate," Sarah said quietly, and desperate men do desperate things. The question is how far he's willing to go to get what he wants. Jack reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a map of the territory, spreading it across the surface and weighing down the corners with books. Red marks indicated where cattle had been stolen, black marks showed where rustler sign had been found, and blue marks represented the location of ranch buildings and defensible positions. "They're working a pattern," Jack explained, tracing the marks with his finger, "hitting the outer ranges first, places where discovery is less likely and response time is longer. But they're moving closer to the main buildings with each raid." "Building up to something big," Tom agreed. "Question is what?" Sarah studied the map, her mind working through the tactical implications, the way Jack had taught her to think about ranch management, always considering multiple variables, always planning for contingencies. "They're not just stealing cattle," she said slowly. "They're testing our responses, learning how quickly we can mobilize, how many men we can field." The men looked at her with surprise and growing respect. "Go on," Jack encouraged. "Thomas threatened you specifically because of me. This isn't just about cattle anymore, it's personal. He wants to prove that he can take whatever he wants from you, starting with me and probably ending with this ranch." Carlos nodded grimly. "The Senora is right. This Hartwell, he wants to break Jack completely, make him lose everything before he kills him." "Then we need to be ready for a direct assault," Jack said. "Tom, how many men can you spare?" 6, maybe 8 if I call in some favors." "I can field 12, Jack said, "plus ourselves and the wives if it comes to that." Sarah felt a chill at the casual way he included the women in his military calculations, but she understood the reality of frontier life. When survival was at stake, everyone fought. Jack pulled his Winchester rifle from the rack behind his desk, checking the action with the automatic precision of a man who had maintained weapons for 20 years. The rifle was more than just a tool, it was an extension of his will, a promise to anyone who threatened his family that they would face consequences they might not survive. "We'll position men here, here, and here," he said, marking the map with quick strokes. "Overlapping fields of fire, fallback positions, and clear lines of communication. If they want a fight, we'll give them one they won't forget." "And if they come for Sarah specifically?" Tom asked. Jack's jaw tightened, and Sarah saw the flicker of something dangerous in his eyes. "Then they'll discover that some things are worth dying for, and some men are worth killing." The next morning brought a message from town, delivered by a boy who couldn't have been more than 14, and who kept glancing nervously at the horizon, as if expecting trouble to materialize from thin air. "Sheriff says to tell you that strangers have been asking questions," the boy reported, his voice cracking with adolescent nerves. "Want to know about the Morrison ranch, about Mrs. Morrison, about how many men you got working here." Jack pressed a silver dollar into the boy's palm. "You tell Sheriff Hawkins we appreciate the warning, and you tell him we're ready for whatever comes." After the boy left, Jack found Sarah in the kitchen, methodically cleaning and oiling the small revolver he had given her for personal protection. Her movements were sure and competent, the result of hours of practice under his patient tutelage. "How do you feel?" he asked, settling into the chair across from her. "Scared," Sarah admitted, "but angry too. Thomas has no right to threaten our life, our home. He made his choice when he walked away from me, and he doesn't get to change his mind just because his backup plan failed." Jack reached across the table and covered her hand with his. "You know I won't let him take you." "I know. But Jack, if something happens to you because of me—" "Stop." His voice was firm but gentle. "This isn't about you anymore, Sarah. This is about men who think they can take whatever they want from honest people, and it's about proving them wrong. You're my wife. This is our home, and no one threatens what's ours without facing the consequences." That afternoon, Maria arrived with her children and enough supplies to last a week. The plan was simple. The women and children would stay in the main house, which had thick stone walls and good fields of fire from the upper windows. The men would be positioned in the outbuildings and along the perimeter, ready to respond to threats from any direction. "You sure about this?" Maria asked as she helped Sarah prepare the upstairs bedrooms for additional occupants. There's still time to ride to town. Wait this out in safety. This is my home, Sarah replied. I'm not running again. Maria smiled with fierce approval. Good. A woman who runs from her first fight never learns how to stop running. By evening, the ranch had taken on the appearance of a military camp. Men cleaned weapons and checked ammunition, while their wives prepared bandages and boiled water. Children were instructed on where to hide if shooting started, and everyone understood that the next few days might determine whether the Morrison Ranch continued to exist. Jack made his final rounds as the sun set, checking guard positions and ensuring that every man understood his role in the defense. When he returned to the house, he found Sarah waiting for him on the front porch, her revolver holstered at her hip and a rifle resting across her knees. You don't have to do this, he said, settling beside her on the porch steps. Yes, I do. Sarah's voice was calm and determined. Thomas thinks he can scare me into running back to him. He needs to learn that I'm not the same woman he left at that altar. Jack studied her profile in the gathering dusk, noting the firm set of her jaw and the steady confidence in her posture. The frightened girl who had collapsed beside his fence post 2 months ago was gone, replaced by a woman who understood her own strength and wasn't afraid to use it. I love you, he said suddenly, the words coming out rough and unpolished but absolutely true. Sarah turned to look at him, her brown eyes soft in the lamplight spilling from the house windows. I love you too. That's why I'm staying to fight. They sat in comfortable silence as the stars came out, both of them listening to the sounds of the night and the quiet movements of the men on guard duty. Tomorrow would bring whatever Thomas and his allies had planned. But tonight, they had this moment of peace before the storm. Whatever happens, Jack said, his hand finding hers in the darkness, I want you to know that marrying you was the best decision I ever made. Even though it's brought you nothing but trouble? Especially because of that. Jack's smile was visible even in the dim light. A man finds out what he's really made of when everything he cares about is on the line. I'm grateful for the chance to find out. In the distance, a night bird called to its mate, and the sound carried across the prairie like a promise that some things endured, no matter what storms came to test them. Sarah squeezed Jack's hand and felt the solid weight of his grandmother's ring on her finger, a symbol of all the hopes and dreams they had built together. Let Thomas come with his threats and his hired guns. Let Fletcher bring his rustlers and his violence. They would find that the Morrison Ranch was defended by more than just walls, and Weaponsit was defended by two people who had discovered that love grown from respect and partnership was stronger than any force that could be brought against it. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of rain from the mountains, and Sarah knew that by tomorrow night, everything would be different. But whatever came, they would face it together, and that knowledge gave her a courage she had never possessed before. In the quiet hours before dawn, as Jack made his final preparations and Sarah ensured that the women and children were safely positioned, both of them understood that they were about to fight for more than just property or safety. They were about to fight for the right to love each other without interference, to build a life together without threat, and to prove that some things were worth any sacrifice to protect. The stage was set, the players were in position, and the only question that remained was whether Thomas Hartwell truly understood what he had set in motion when he decided to threaten a woman who had learned to fight for what she loved. They came with the storm. Sarah woke to the sound of rain lashing against the bedroom windows and the low rumble of thunder rolling across the mountains. The storm had moved in faster than expected, turning the autumn night into a maelstrom of wind and water that would provide perfect cover for men with dark intentions. She slipped from her bed and padded to the window, peering through the rain-streaked glass toward the barn where Jack had taken the final watch. The storm lantern he carried was barely visible through the sheets of rain, a small beacon of light in the darkness that somehow made her feel less alone. A soft knock at her door interrupted her vigil. Sarah, Maria's voice was barely audible above the storm. Something's wrong. The men in the barn, their light went out. Sarah's blood turned to ice. Jack would never let his lantern go out during a watch. not with the threat of attack hanging over them. She dressed quickly in her darkest clothes and checked her revolver, making sure it was loaded and ready. "Wake the other women," she whispered to Maria. "Get everyone to the positions we discussed. And Maria, if anything happens to me, make sure Jack knows I chose to fight." The main floor of the house was dark and silent, but Sarah could feel the tension in the air like electricity before lightning strikes. She made her way to the kitchen door that faced the barn, her heart hammering against her ribs as she tried to see through the storm. Lightning flashed, illuminating the yard for a brief, brilliant moment. And in that instant, Sarah saw them dark figures moving between the buildings with the careful precision of men who had done this before. Too many figures, more than Fletcher's original gang, which meant Thomas had brought additional men for this assault. Another flash of lightning, and Sarah caught sight of Jack, pressed against the side of the barn, his rifle ready, but his position clearly compromised. He was outnumbered and surrounded, and the storm was preventing him from seeing all the threats moving through the darkness. Sarah made a decision that would have terrified her 2 months ago, but felt natural now. She eased open the kitchen door and slipped into the storm, the rain immediately soaking through her clothes and the wind nearly knocking her off her feet. But she kept moving, using the buildings and equipment as cover while she worked her way toward Jack's position. The storm lantern sat abandoned near the barn door, its flame extinguished by the wind and rain. Sarah realized it had been put out, deliberately a signal that the attack had begun. She crept along the barn wall, her revolver ready and her eyes straining to pierce the darkness. "Jack," she whispered when she reached his position. He spun toward her, his rifle nearly coming up before he recognized her voice. "Sarah, what are you doing out here? I told you to stay in the house. The house is secure. You're the one who's trapped." Sarah pressed herself against the barn wall beside him, rain streaming down her face. "How many?" "At least 8 that I've seen, probably more. They're using the storm as cover, just like we would have done." Jack's voice carried a grudging respect for his enemy's tactics, even as he prepared to fight them. Lightning illuminated the yard again, and this time Sarah saw a figure she recognized: Thomas Hartwell, standing near the corral with a rifle in his hands and an expression of grim determination on his handsome face. He was dressed for the weather in a long coat and wide-brimmed hat, but there was something in his posture that spoke of desperation rather than confidence. "He's really here," Sarah breathed, surprised despite everything at seeing Thomas in the middle of this violence. "Desperate men do desperate things," Jack said, echoing her own words from earlier. "But desperation makes them careless too." As if to prove his point, one of the rustlers moved too far from cover, exposing himself to Jack's position. The Winchester spoke once, a sharp crack that cut through the storm, and the man spun and fell. Immediately, the darkness erupted with answering gunfire, muzzle flashes winking like deadly fireflies as the attackers revealed their positions. Jack pulled Sarah down behind a water trough as bullets whined overhead, some striking the barn wall and others splashing into the mud around them. "This is going to get worse before it gets better," he said, reloading his rifle with practiced efficiency. "Then we'd better make sure we're the ones still standing when it's over," Sarah replied, checking her revolver one more time. The battle settled into a deadly game of movement and concealment, with both sides using the storm and the darkness to mask their positions. Jack and Sarah worked as a team, covering each other as they moved between defensive positions, picking their shots carefully and making every bullet count. From the house came the occasional crack of rifle fire, evidence that the other women were doing their part to defend their sanctuary. Sarah felt a fierce pride in Maria and the others, frontier women who understood that survival sometimes required violence and were prepared to do what was necessary. "Sarah," Thomas's voice cut through the storm, barely audible above the wind and rain. "I know you're out there. This doesn't have to end in blood. Come with me now, and no one else has to die." Jack's jaw tightened, and Sarah saw him shift his rifle toward the sound of Thomas's voice. "Give me one clear shot," he muttered. "Sarah," Thomas called again. "Your husband is outnumbered and outgunned. Don't let your stubbornness get him killed." Sarah felt something cold and hard settle in her chest as she realized what Thomas was trying to do. He was using her love for Jack as a weapon, trying to make her believe that surrender was the only way to save the man she cared about. "He's trying to draw me out," she said quietly. "And he's about to succeed," Jack replied grimly. "Because if you so much as think about sacrificing yourself for me, I'll turn you over my knee, wedding ring or no wedding ring." Despite everything, Sarah found herself smiling at the threat. "Promises, promises, Mr. Morrison." Lightning flashed again, longer and brighter this time, and in that extended moment of illumination, Sarah saw something that changed everything. Fletcher and 2 of his men were moving toward the house, using the storm to mask their approach to where the women and children were sheltering. "Jack," she whispered urgently, "the house." He followed her gaze and cursed viciously when he saw the danger. The women were good shots, but they couldn't defend against a direct assault while also protecting the children. Someone had to warn them, had to get between them and the approaching threat. "I'll go," Sarah said, already moving. "Like hell you will," Jack grabbed her arm. "I won't let you." "You don't have a choice," Sarah interrupted. "You're the best shot we have, and you're needed here to keep the main group pinned down. I'm smaller, faster, and I know every inch of this property. I can make it to the house." Jack stared at her for a long moment, his blue eyes reflecting the lightning flashes and something deeper than knowledge that she was right, and the agony of letting her go into danger. "Be careful," he said finally, his voice rough with emotion. "Be ready," Sarah replied. "When I start shooting from the house, that's your signal to push forward." She kissed him quickly, fiercely, tasting rain and desperation and love. Then she was gone, slipping away into the storm-lashed darkness like a ghost bent on protecting everything that mattered to her. Behind her, Jack settled into position with his rifle and prepared to give the performance of his life, keeping an entire gang of rustlers focused on him, while the woman he loved raced through the night to save the people who had become their family. The storm raged on, and the real battle was just beginning. Sarah reached the house just as Fletcher's men were positioning themselves beneath the kitchen windows. She could see Maria's silhouette in the upstairs window, rifle ready but unaware of the immediate threat below. There was no time for subtlety, no time for careful planning. There was only the need to act before it was too late. Sarah's revolver spoke 3 times in rapid succession, the shots cracking like thunder as she targeted the men below the windows. 2 of them fell immediately, crying out in pain and surprise. The third spun toward her, his own weapon coming up, but Maria's rifle barked from above, and the man pitched forward into the mud. "Sarah!" Maria called from the window. "Are you hit?" "I'm fine. Fletcher's trying to flank you from the east side." Sarah pressed herself against the house wall, reloading her revolver with fingers that trembled slightly from adrenaline rather than fear. "Keep everyone away from those windows." Fletcher himself appeared around the corner of the house, his cold eyes fixed on Sarah with murderous intent. "Well, well, the little bride wants to play with grown-up guns." "This little bride has been practicing," Sarah replied, her voice steadier than she felt. Fletcher's smile was ugly in the lightning flashes. "Let's see how much you've learned." The gunfight that followed was brief but vicious. Fletcher was an experienced killer, but Sarah had advantages. He hadn't counted on intimate knowledge of the terrain, desperation to protect her family, and training from a man who understood that accuracy mattered more than speed. Sarah's first shot took Fletcher in the shoulder, spinning him but not dropping him. His return fire shattered the window above her head, showering her with glass. Her second shot was better placed, catching him in the chest and sending him stumbling backward into the corral fence. "Not bad for a bride," Fletcher gasped, his voice thick with blood and surprise. "But not good enough." He raised his gun for one final shot, but the Winchester rifle that spoke from the darkness behind him wasn't Sarah's weapon. Jack had arrived, moving through the storm like an avenging angel, and his shot was perfect. Fletcher collapsed without another word. His threat to their family ended forever. "Are you hurt?" Jack asked, reaching Sarah in 3 quick strides and running his hands over her as if checking for wounds. "I'm fine. The others?" "Scattered or dead." Tom's men came up from the south just as the shooting started. Caught them between 2 fires. Jack pulled her against him, holding her tightly as if he could absorb her into his very bones. "It's over, Sarah. It's finally over." But even as he spoke, they heard horses approaching at a gallop. Both of them turned, weapons ready, only to see Thomas Hartwell riding toward them through the rain. His fine clothes were sodden and muddy, his handsome face twisted with fury and defeat. "This isn't over," he shouted, pulling his horse to a sliding stop 20 feet away. "You think you've won, but you've won nothing. Sarah belongs with me. She was promised to me." "She was never promised to you," Jack replied calmly, his rifle aimed steadily at Thomas's chest. "You gave up any claim to her when you walked away. I came back for her." "You came back because your other plans failed," Sarah said, stepping out from behind Jack. "Thomas, look at yourself. Look at what you've become. You're working with rustlers and killers, threatening innocent people, all because you can't accept that I've found something better than what you offered me." Thomas's face contorted with rage. "Better? With him? Sarah, you're living like a savage in the middle of nowhere, cooking for cowboys and playing at being a rancher's wife. I could give you Denver, society, a real life." "This is my real life," Sarah said firmly. "Jack is my real husband, this ranch is my real home, and these people are my real family. What you're offering isn't civilization, Thomas, it's a prison with prettier bars." For a moment, Thomas just stared at her, and Sarah saw something desperate and broken in his eyes. The golden boy who had charmed every woman in Cedar Ridge was gone, replaced by a man who had gambled everything on a fantasy and lost. "You'll regret this," he said finally, "when the loneliness and the hardship wear you down, when you realize what you've given up, you'll regret choosing him over me." "The only thing I regret," Sarah said quietly, "is that I ever believed your promises in the first place." Thomas wheeled his horse around and spurred it into the storm, disappearing into the darkness like the ghost of a dream that had never been real to begin with. Sarah watched him go and felt something that had been knotted tight in her chest for months finally relax. "Think he'll come back?" Jack asked. "No," Sarah said with certainty. "Thomas never liked anything that required real effort, and we've just shown him how much effort it would take to get what he wants. He'll find someone else to blame for his problems." The rain was beginning to ease, and in the distance, Sarah could see the lights of Tom Bradley's men as they secured the ranch and tended to the wounded. The immediate danger was past, but she knew it would take time for the fear to fully fade. "Come on," Jack said, taking her hand. "Let's go see about our people." The kitchen had become a makeshift hospital, with Maria and the other women tending to minor wounds and serving coffee to men who were coming down from the high tension of battle. Miguel and Isabella sat at the kitchen table, wide-eyed with excitement at having witnessed their first real gunfight, while their mother fussed over a cowboy who had taken a graze across his arm. "Signora Sarah!" Isabella jumped up from her chair and ran to hug Sarah's legs. "You were so brave, like a hero in the stories." Sarah knelt down to the little girl's level, smoothing her dark hair with gentle hands. "Heroes are just regular people who do what needs to be done when it needs doing, Mija. Remember that." Carlos appeared in the doorway, his hat in his hands, and a grim smile on his weathered face. "We found their camp about 2 miles south. Looks like they'd been watching us for weeks, learning our routines, but they won't be watching anyone anymore." "Any of our people seriously hurt?" Jack asked. "Nothing that won't heal. Tom lost 1 man, but he went down fighting and took 2 of them with him." Carlos's expression darkened. "We found something else too, Patron. Papers in Fletcher's saddlebags, letters from someone in Denver, coordinating the whole operation. This was bigger than just rustling cattle." Jack and Sarah exchanged glances. "Thomas's banker friend," Sarah said quietly. "I'll bet Victoria Ashford's father was planning to acquire distressed ranch properties after the rustlers drove the owners out." "Makes sense," Jack agreed. "Create the problem, then profit from the solution." If we hadn't stopped them here, they would have moved on to the next ranch, and the next, until they'd driven everyone out or killed anyone who wouldn't sell. Sarah felt a chill at how close they had come to losing everything, not just to common criminals, but to a conspiracy that would have destroyed the entire ranching community. The thought made her appreciate even more what they had fought to protect. As the night wore on and the storm finally began to clear, Sarah found herself in the parlor with a cup of coffee and a new wedding dress draped across her lap. She had been working on it in secret for weeks, planning to surprise Jack when the time felt right for them to renew their vows with genuine love instead of mere convenience. The dress was simple but beautiful cream-colored cotton with delicate embroidery. She had done herself during quiet evenings when Jack was reading by the fire. It represented everything she had learned about herself in the past 2 months, that she was capable of more than she had ever imagined, that love could grow from respect and partnership, and that sometimes the best things in life came disguised as practical necessities. "It's beautiful," Jack said from the doorway, and Sarah looked up to find him watching her with an expression of wonder. "I was saving it for a special occasion," she said, setting down her coffee cup. "I thought maybe when all this was over, we could have a real wedding. Not the business arrangement we started with, but something that celebrates what we've found together." Jack crossed the room and knelt beside her chair, taking her hands in his work-roughened ones. "Sarah Morrison, would you do me the honor of marrying me again? Not because you need a home or I need a wife, but because we've discovered that we need each other." Sarah's eyes filled with tear-happy tears this time, the kind that came from having everything you had ever wanted within reach. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I'll marry you again and again, and every day for the rest of our lives if you'll have me." Jack's kiss was soft and sweet and full of promises for their future together. When they broke apart, Sarah saw that the storm had finally passed completely, leaving a sky full of stars visible through the parlor windows. "When?" Jack asked. "Sunday," Sarah said decisively, "right here in our own parlor, with our people around us and no secrets between us. Just two people who found each other when they needed it most, and discovered that the best love stories don't always start with love sometimes. They start with hope and grow into something better than either person could have imagined." Alone. Jack stood and helped her to her feet, the wedding dress rustling between them like a promise of new beginnings. "Mrs. Morrison," he said formally, "I believe this is going to be the start of a beautiful marriage." "Mr. Morrison," Sarah replied with a smile that felt like sunshine after rain, "I believe you're absolutely right." Outside, the ranch settled into peaceful quiet under a sky full of stars, and Sarah knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together as partners, friends, and lovers who had fought for the right to choose each other freely. The worst was behind them now. The best was yet to come. Spring came early to the Morrison Ranch that year, as if the land itself was celebrating the peace that had settled over the territory after the events of that stormy night in late autumn. Sarah stood on the front porch of the house, her hand resting on the gentle swell of her belly where their first child grew, and watched Jack work with Carlos to position the foundation stones for the new house they were building on the hill overlooking the main ranch. The foundation stone Jack was placing with such care was larger than the others, a cornerstone that would anchor everything they built upon it. It had been quarried from their own land, shaped by their own hands, and would support a home designed to shelter not just the two of them, but the family they were creating together. "A little to the left," Sarah called out, and Jack looked up with the patient smile he wore whenever she offered suggestions about construction work she had never done but somehow felt qualified to supervise. "Yes, ma'am," he replied, adjusting the stone with exaggerated precision. "Is that better, Mrs. Morrison?" "Perfect, Mr. Morrison," Sarah answered, her hand moving unconsciously to her ring finger where Jack's grandmother's wedding band caught the morning sunlight like a promise kept. It had been 6 months since Thomas Hartwell had ridden away into the storm, and 5 months since the territorial authorities had arrested the remaining members of Fletcher's gang and the Denver bankers who had been financing their operations. The conspiracy had been larger than anyone had imagined, reaching into territorial politics and land speculation schemes that would have devastated the entire ranching community if left unchecked. Thomas himself had disappeared completely, some said to California, others to Mexico. Sarah found she didn't care where he had gone as long as it was far from the life she had built with Jack. He had become like a bad dream that faded with the morning light. Something that had once seemed important, but now felt insignificant compared to the real happiness she had found. The second wedding had been everything their first ceremony was not. Held in the parlor of their own home on a Sunday afternoon in December, it had been witnessed by their extended ranch family and blessed by a circuit preacher who understood that love came in many forms and didn't always follow the conventional path. Sarah had worn her handmade dress and carried wildflowers that Maria's children had picked from the protected valley where such blooms survived even the early winter. But more important than the ceremony itself was what it represented, a free choice made by two people who had discovered that the best partnerships were built on mutual respect, shared purpose, and the kind of deep affection that grew stronger rather than weaker when tested by adversity. The baby was due in late summer, and Jack had thrown himself into preparations with the same methodical thoroughness he brought to everything else. The new house would be finished before the birth, with a nursery positioned to catch the morning sun and a kitchen large enough for the big family they both hoped to raise. Their children would grow up knowing they were wanted and loved, that their parents had chosen each other and their life together with open eyes and grateful hearts. "Sarah!" Maria's voice carried across the yard from the direction of the main house. "The ladies from town are here for the quilting circle." Sarah waved acknowledgement and made her way carefully down from the porch, her movements slowed but not impaired by the pregnancy. The weekly quilting circle had become one of her favorite traditions, a chance for the ranch wives and town ladies to gather and share news while working on practical projects that would benefit the entire community. Today they were finishing a quilt for the new baby, each woman contributing a square that told a story or shared a blessing. Sarah's own square depicted the wooden bird Jack had carved for her during their early days together, its wings spread in eternal flight toward a horizon full of possibility. As she entered the parlor, where the women had already spread out their work, Sarah felt the deep satisfaction of belonging somewhere, of being part of a community that had accepted her not because of who she had been, but because of who she had chosen to become. These women had seen her face down armed rustlers and stand her ground against men who would have intimidated weaker souls. They respected her, not for her connections or her background, but for her character and her competence. "How are you feeling, dear?" asked Mrs. Henderson, the wife of the neighboring rancher, who had become Sarah's closest friend among the established ranch wives. "Like I'm carrying a future cowboy who's already practicing his bronc riding," Sarah replied, settling into her chair with a grateful sigh. "Jack thinks it's a boy because of how active he is." "And what do you think?" Maria asked, her needle already flying through the bright fabric of her contribution to the quilt. "I think it doesn't matter as long as he or she is healthy and grows up understanding that this land and this life are privileges to be earned, not rights to be taken for granted." The afternoon passed pleasantly, filled with gentle gossip and shared wisdom about child rearing and household management. As the sun began to sink toward the western mountains, the women packed up their work and prepared to leave, but not before each had offered Sarah some piece of advice or encouragement for the challenges ahead. After the last visitor had departed, Sarah found herself alone in the parlor with the partially completed quilt spread across her lap. Each square told a different story. Maria's depicted the morning glories that climbed the walls of her adobe house. Mrs. Henderson's showed the brand of her family's ranch, and the pastor's wife had contributed a square with a cross surrounded by wildflowers. But it was Jack's contribution that touched her most deeply. He had worked on it secretly in the evenings after she had gone to bed, and when he finally revealed it, Sarah had been moved to tears by what she saw. The square showed two figures standing before a house very much like the one they were building on the hill. But what made it special was the way he had depicted them not as a man protecting a fragile woman, but as equal partners facing the future together. "Admiring the handiwork?" Jack asked from the doorway, his day's work finished and his face clean of the dust and sweat that came with hard labor. "Admiring the sentiment," Sarah replied, tracing the careful stitches that outlined the figures in the square. "You made us look like we belong together." "We do belong together," Jack said, settling beside her on the sofa and pulling her carefully against his side. "Took me a while to realize it, but some things are worth waiting for." Sarah nestled into the warmth of his embrace, feeling the baby stir restlessly, as if responding to the sound of his father's voice. "Any regrets about the practical arrangement that turned into something more?" "Only that I didn't have the sense to ask you to marry me properly the first time," Jack said, his hand coming to rest on her belly where their child grew. "But maybe it was better this way. We got to know each other as we really are, not as we thought we wanted to be." As if summoned by their conversation, the baby delivered a particularly energetic kick that made Sarah gasp and Jack laugh with delight. "Definitely a cowboy," he said confidently. "Or a cowgirl with strong opinions about being ignored," Sarah countered. "Either way, this child is going to know from birth that he or she comes from people who don't give up when life gets difficult." The sun had set completely by now, and the first stars were appearing in the clear mountain sky. Through the parlor windows, Sarah could see the framework of their new house outlined against the horizon, a promise of the future they were building together, one foundation stone at a time. "I love you, Jack Morrison," she said quietly, the words carrying all the weight of gratitude and commitment and wonder that had grown between them since that first desperate night when he had found her weeping beside his fence post. "I love you too, Sarah Morrison," he replied, and in his voice she heard the echo of her own amazement that two broken people could find healing in each other, that the best love stories sometimes began with the most practical arrangements, and that sometimes the greatest adventures started with the simple decision to stay and fight for what mattered most. Outside, the wind sang through the grass of the endless prairie, carrying the promise of new seasons and new challenges and new joys yet to come. Inside, two people who had married for convenience and discovered passion sat in comfortable silence, their hands linked and their hearts full, surrounded by the evidence of a life built on mutual respect, shared purpose, and the kind of love that grew stronger rather than weaker when tested by time and trouble. The Morrison Ranch stretched around them in all directions, vast and demanding and beautiful, a testament to what could be accomplished when two people chose to face the future together rather than apart. And in the quiet hours before sleep, as Jack and Sarah made their final rounds through the house that had become a true home, both of them understood that they had found something rarer and more valuable than gold or silver or any treasure the frontier might yield. They had found each other, and that was worth everything.